when I talk to you about nouns, nouns are changed through something we call declension. I also said that depending on which textbook you're using, if you're looking at any instructions, there are a lot of varying references to Greek verbs. Technically, the right way to address Greek verbs is not declension, but conjugation. When I first started, I didn't want to bring confusion, so I used the word declension, but that is for nouns. Conjugation is for verbs. So, most verbs have person. At least I hope they do. Let's write this here. Most verbs have person. We're talking about Greek verbs. First person, I, right? And so forth. We'll put here first person singular, right? And you can go I, you, me, they, whatever. All right. So let's put number one right there. Second thing, Greek verbs will have number. That is, they will either be singular or plural. This stuff is kind of the basics. Wait, it gets, we'll get into some more complicated stuff, and then you'll say, yeah, it's not that basic, but it is. All right, number three, tense. And I'm going to break tense into two categories. So we'll say tense, but tense is both time, and aspect. All right. So, time, that's pretty simple. Present, past, or should I say past, present, future, but it's okay, let's be different. Put the past in the middle, nothing like that. Aspect indicates how the occurrence of the action is viewed. So let me kind of talk this out, because I wrote this out for myself to give you real examples. So the action, if it occurs, it just simply occurs, which is describing aspect. We fell, right? That's a simple action. The action, if it is in progress, we were falling. Now, I'm using were and not are for a reason. You'll see why in a minute. Aspect can be repeated. We used to fall, in other words, habitually. And an action that is complete. We had fallen. So let's talk about the simple aspect for a minute, and we'll go over this again. Simple aspect, we fell. If you move into the what we'll call progressive, we were falling. That is something that is in the act of unfolding or happening. We were falling. If I were telling a story, we were all holding hands walking down the street and we were falling. I don't know how that makes sense, but eventually we started a big snowball of people. I don't know, right? We used to fall. That is habitual or repeated. We had fallen. The aspect is complete. So you've got some idea of how aspect works. I mean, if you want to put beside aspect all of what I just said, I'll repeat that again. Simple, that's just an action, a simple action. Progressive, habitual or repeated, and complete. Greek has 7 tenses, switching gears now. 7 tenses to indicate mood. These are more like things that terms you're probably most familiar with. So in the Greek you've got, I'm just going to read them out and you can write them. You've got present tense. And we need to be careful because sometimes people think present tense is something that is simply happening now. But in the Greek, what you have is an action in present time with a progressive or repeated aspect. So when you read a verb, when you look at a verb, when you parse or morphologically tag something and it is in the present tense, it not only is talking about present time, but something that is ongoing or being repeated or progressively unfolding. I am falling. Okay, that's present tense. That's number one. 2, future tense, an action in the future, which can be a simple aspect, such as I shall fall, or progressive and repeated, as in I shall be falling. I tried to find a verb that could be universally used, and at some point you run into roadblocks even with this one, but I'm going to do my best. So present, future, perfect. Perfect is number 3. That is an action in present time and always completed. So something that is in the present time, but it's always completed. The aspect is completed. I have fallen. Now, the challenge with this is trying to make right equivalence into English, because when you start to see how the Greek verb works, you realize that we've got to put in a whole bunch of words, and sometimes it'll be words, adverbs, and then some to help what the Greek basically brings clarity to with less. Now, this is where it gets fun. If you are not a grammarian, the first 3 that I've just given you are pretty simple. If you've studied another language, specifically a Latin-based language, this next one will make sense to you. The pluperfect tense. The name comes from the Latin, which is more than completed. I don't know how you get more than completed, but it's more than completed, right? And it's also called the past perfect tense, but for this conversation we're going to talk about pluperfect. Describes an action in past time and always conveys a completed aspect. I had fallen. Now, I want you to see the difference between the 2 English examples I've given between the perfect tense and the pluperfect, which is I have fallen and I had fallen. So the perfect tense, I have, has a present, carries a present time aspect to it, and the pluperfect has a past time, if that makes any sense to you. So one is about the present and one is about the past. Number 5, future perfect tense. That is an action in the future, always has a completed aspect. Boy, this is going to sound really bad. This is where I said you run into stumbling blocks here. I shall have fallen. Wow. Don't know how you put that together. This is extremely rare, by the way, in the Greek. So note it. It may occur. If it occurs once or twice in the Bible, you'll be lucky. All right. Number 6, which is one you've heard me reference many times before, the imperfect, which is Latin for incomplete. It describes an action in past time, but always a progressive, repeated, so I was falling or I used to fall. So just think not complete and in the past. 7 is the aorist. You've seen this before. Aorist looks like that when you write it. Action in past time, always simple aspect, describes an event which happens once and for all. Now, you have to really forgive me for this. I'm trying to give you the most basic synopsis of how this is used. However, you're going to run into a theological minefield in using this one-size-fits-all I just gave. And you'll see why many doctrines have been established based on scholars using a one-size-fits-all type, what I just gave you, which is very general, it's very generic. And then you get into a passage of Scripture, and if it is something that's happened once and for all, and that must be applied universally to everything, you're going to have some problems. So this is one where I tell you I'm giving you a general idea. There'll be a few more as I get into the moods as well. I'm sorry. These tenses, I don't know what I did here. We're going to get to moods. Forgive me. The aorist, you really must, it's a case by case, but just as a right way of saying this, it does describe something that is an action in the past time. The once and for all is kind of like putting a big net over it. And then, as I said, case by case, we'll have to look at how that applies. All right. I don't know why I wrote this here, because we just talked about 7 tenses. The moods are as follows. Mood indicates the type of statement which one is making. Factual, hypothetical, wishful, commanding, etc. In the Greek, there are 4 moods: indicative, subjunctive, optative, and imperative. Now, you've heard me say this before. So the first one of these 4 is the indicative. And every time I've written out a verb and I've said it's in the indicative, and I've always said factual. That's what it stands for. When you read that regarding a verb that is in the indicative, it is making a factual statement. Second, subjunctive. Now, I describe this as a mood of possibility. And the best, interestingly enough, the best language when one translates the subjunctive, trying to get a feel for it, would actually be French. So if any of you have French as a second language, think of the subjunctive in French and you'll nail it. It's a mood of possibility. And if you are looking through a textbook, I challenge you to put together 3 or 4 different textbooks, and you'll find that nobody agrees on how exactly they should define the subjunctive. There is no fixed formula for this, and I will explain when we get into actually looking at the subjunctive. Right now I'm just introducing it. But think mood of possibility, something that may, could possibly happen, all right? Optative mood, which we might understand with expressions in the English, such as if we should see, or we might see, or may we always see, sounds a little like the words I just used for the subjunctive, except the difference is subjunctive will lend heavily in the Greek to the possibility of actually doing an action, versus optative, which may be less on the side of possibility and more on the side of permission, although that's kind of a lame way of explaining that. We'll also open up this when we do a deeper study. It won't be super in-depth, but I will go through each one of these using examples so you can see what it looks like and how we might translate it as we go using an actual example. And the last one is imperative. Imperative mood gives a command: look, go, see. Now, this is the one, in my opinion, that most people who do not study language, who are in a church somewhere, hate. When Scripture is quoted and the verb, say it's Jesus saying something and it's in the imperative, for some reason, there's a coiling back, as if to say, that's a command. You've got to do that. Well, I didn't invent the language, and that's the way it reads. So, that's the thing about when you get into studying the nuances of languages, you realize that Thank God that the New Testament is written in Greek so we can see exactly the force and the color, whereas if we were reading the New Testament and it was written in Hebrew, we'd still be trying to figure out and get some of that. It's not lacking here. This is one you should be really, really familiar with because you've only heard it as long as you've been listening, which is voice. Greek voice has 3: active, passive, and middle. And if you remember, in the active, the subject performs the action indicated. Once I introduce these, we'll go back and look at each one in the next lesson. This active voice can be transitive or intransitive. And I want to explain those terms. I don't mean to insult anyone who knows what they are, but there are a lot of people who don't have good gestalt of grammar, so that is also my intention, to be able to kind of say this is what this means or this is how this functions here. And then if you happen to buy a textbook, you're not lost. And that's the worst thing that can happen, is you want to learn, but there's things that are stumbling blocks, and every one of us has those at every level. It's not just like, oh, somebody's just starting out, so they don't know. No, every level has that. As you progress, you realize that there's a lot of things you don't know. And then you realize you don't know what you don't know, and you need to learn more, right? That's what I said. Okay. Whew. Passive. Remember that. The passive voice, the subject receives the action, is being acted upon. So I stand still and something is done to me. I am not doing it. Often those words like receiving, I received something, usually is in the passive. Something that's done to me, I am not doing it. And then the middle voice, which basically somewhat of the equivalent would be our English reflexive, doing something for himself or herself. It is the person, again, subject performs the act, but they are doing it for themselves. And usually that's been kind of the catch-all here. If you've heard that for years, when you get into a little bit deeper Greek lessons, you find that there are layers of the middle voice that are even more telling. So this just kind of gives you the nuts and bolts. But it's very interesting because just with the information I've given you tonight, which is just an introduction, just an overview, you've got the bird's eye view of Greek verbs. And as I said, we'll go in next lesson and I will explain, we'll go through and probably do one of the things that we have in English. We've got, I think, 3 types of these. You get sing, sang, sung, right? Do, did, done, right? There's 3. In English, we've got, when we're putting together a verb, when we're making action words happen, you've got 3 different forms. In the Greek, you've got 7 of those, and we'll discuss those as well, because that's something you almost have to learn. I'm not expecting people to memorize and look. You can make your own charts. In fact, probably when I do the verbs, I'll do something it'll be in my handwriting, but it'll be some type of a download, so you don't have to sit and try to copiously copy out what I've done, because it'll be somewhat of a paradigm that you probably need to learn and look at. So you've got the introduction, and again, these lessons are just the most basic, just to kind of get you going. I was really thrilled, by the way, in my mail, I saw somebody had made a little note to me in Greek, which is really nice. I get Hebrew notes. It was wonderful. It's a good group of people writing me things. I'm just glad that you all know what you're writing.